The hot summer air pressed down on Fort Hamilton's main gate as Stanley Burns rolled up on his deep crimson vintage Indian Chief motorcycle. At 82, his frame was slight but steady, his skin sun-touched, hands gnarled with age, resting calmly on the handlebars. His pale blue eyes held a quiet focus, staring down the long asphalt stretch as though it held a memory only he could see. Corporal Miller, young, cocky, and sharply uniformed, leaned against the guard shack. Mirrored sunglasses hid his eyes, but his smirk betrayed complete disdain. Beside him, Private Davies snickered, eager to mimic his partner's arrogance. "Is this some kind of joke, old-timer?" Miller barked, voice sharp and condescending. "License and registration." "Step off the bike, sir." Stanley moved deliberately, exuding calm. He reached into the leather saddlebag and produced a worn wallet. From it, he drew a yellowed laminated ID, and a driver's license photos of a younger man stared back with flinty eyes. Handing them over, he said simply, "I have an appointment." "With the base historian." Miller barked a laugh, inspecting the older ID. "Looks like something you printed off the internet, Grandpa," he jeered. The line of impatient cars honked behind, but Stanley's gaze remained unwavering. A flicker of irritation passed through his eyes as Miller shoved the motorcycle slightly. "Please don't touch my bike," Stanley said quietly, his voice low and gravelly. The chill in his tone made Miller pause, but he saw only a challenge, not authority. The young corporal reached for his radio, ready to report a security threat. Meanwhile, Captain Maria Flores, third-generation soldier, observed from her car in the queue. She knew respect for veterans ran deeper than procedure. Seeing Miller escalate the confrontation, she dialed Sergeant Major Evans, the one man who could act with absolute authority. "They're harassing an elderly veteran," she said urgently. "He's being accused of a fake ID." Evans's voice was tight with alarm. "Do not interfere. Stay put." Code Black. Within minutes, Fort Hamilton erupted in action. Sirens wailed as SUVs, armored Humvees, and the honor guard raced to the main gate. General Thompson himself stepped from a black SUV. Face stormy with controlled rage, Miller froze, his hand still on Stanley's arm. As the general strode past the MPs and positioned himself 3 feet from Stanley Burns, "On behalf of the United States Army, I apologize," he said, voice ringing across the silent gate. "It is an absolute honor to have you here." Stanley nodded, gravelly voice calm. "It's all right, son. They don't know." The general turned to the assembled crowd, explaining that Stanley Burns was a founding member of the Ghost Reconnaissance Unit, a Cold War secret operative whose actions had prevented multiple nuclear incidents. Every medal he held, some classified, spoke of heroism unseen by the public. Miller and Davies, once confident, now faced profound shame. Stanley finally addressed them gently. "Pride is a heavy coat. It keeps you warm, but it can drown you. The uniform doesn't make the soldier. The heart does. Learn from this." The lesson had been delivered, not with force, but with quiet authority, respect, and history. Miller, still flushed with ego, held Stanley's peculiar ID card up to the scanner. The machine emitted a dismissive beep, flashing "invalid credential" in bright red. "See? Fake," Miller declared theatrically to Davies and the small crowd now filming on their phones. He flicked the card onto the dusty pavement at Stanley's feet. Stanley's pale blue eyes, however, never wavered. He didn't bend to retrieve the ID, standing as if anchored by decades of resolve. The calm defiance infuriated Miller, who stepped forward, voice rising. "You're a potential security risk, impersonating whatever it is you think you are. Hands behind your back now." Davies hesitated, uneasy. "Maybe we should just call the shift sergeant?" he whispered, eyes darting at the crowd. But Miller, intoxicated by perceived authority, ignored him. He grabbed Stanley's thin arm, a physical gesture that sealed a moment that would ripple through the base's chain of command. Then came the sirens, a full-blown military response, not a local police alarm. 3 black SUVs with flashing lights roared down the main gate road, weaving with tactical precision. Armored Humvees followed immediately, their engines growling. Doors flew open, and a dozen honor guards in immaculate blue dress uniforms, white gloves, and polished rifles formed a perfect corridor leading from the lead SUV. The provost marshal, a stern lieutenant colonel, leapt from his vehicle, scanning for a threat. But all eyes were on Stanley Burns, still calm, a nearly invisible aura of authority surrounding him. Miller froze, his hand on Stanley's arm, realizing the scale of the response was beyond comprehension. General Thompson stepped from the lead SUV, his face a controlled storm. He strode past the provost marshal, ignoring Miller entirely, focusing solely on Stanley. Within 3 feet, the general drew up to full height and rendered the most respectful, precise salute of his career. "Mr. Burns," his voice boomed across the gate, "on behalf of the United States Army, I apologize for the reception you've received. It is an absolute honor to have you here." Stanley nodded slowly, gravelly voice steady. "It's all right, son. They don't know." Thompson addressed the crowd and soldiers, revealing Stanley's true identity, founding member of the Ghost Reconnaissance Unit, a Cold War operative whose classified actions had prevented multiple nuclear crises. The medals Stanley had, some officially non-existent, were symbols of heroism beyond public recognition. The young guard's humiliation was complete. Miller went pale, Davies openly wept. Stanley, however, turned his attention to them, softening. "Pride is a heavy coat," he said. "It keeps you warm, but can drown you. The uniform doesn't make the soldier, the heart does. Learn from this." The lesson was delivered not through force, but through quiet authority, history, and reverence. Setting the tone for respect across Fort Hamilton and beyond. The crowd at the gate was silent, phones raised but frozen mid-recording. General Thompson's gaze remained fixed on Stanley Burns, whose calm presence seemed to absorb the chaos around him. Miller and Davies stood stupefied, the weight of their arrogance crashing down like a tidal wave. Every fiber of the young corporals being screamed for an explanation, yet none came. Captain Maria Flores, standing off to the side near her car, had watched the entire escalation. Her fingers still gripped her phone, the screen casting a faint glow on her determined face. She had witnessed disrespect toward a veteran countless times, but this was different. Stanley Burns was not merely a veteran, he was a living testament to a chapter of military history hidden from public view. The general's voice rang out, cutting through the tension like a finely honed blade. "For those of you who do not know," he began, projecting authority over the hushed crowd, "the man before you is Stanley Burns. The identification card dismissed as fake by this corporal is a Level 1 legacy clearance. Inactive for 40 years, it bypasses standard systems. Few living people are cleared to know his true identity." A collective gasp rippled through the onlookers. The implication sank in. The man they had mocked, nearly assaulted, was a figure of monumental significance. Stanley's life, etched in courage and secrecy, had saved countless others without public recognition. Miller's eyes widened in disbelief as the general continued. Stanley Burns was a founding member and field operative of the Ghost Reconnaissance Unit during the Cold War, a unit so classified the United States government denied its existence until 2015. His solo operations behind enemy lines prevented multiple nuclear conflicts. He holds the Distinguished Service Cross, 3 Silver Stars, and a Medal of Honor awarded in a classified ceremony by President Kennedy, a medal that officially does not exist. The weight of the words crushed the young guards. Miller went pale, Davies broke into tears. The crowd, recording every moment, felt the gravity of the revelation. Respect replaced curiosity and mockery. Stanley, unflinching, finally addressed the young soldiers. His voice, gravelly yet commanding, carried both wisdom and compassion. Pride is a heavy coat. It keeps you warm but can drown you. The uniform does not make the soldier, the heart does. Learn from this. Miller, barely holding back shame, bowed his head. Davies wept quietly, absorbing the lesson more through humiliation than comprehension. Stanley's thin hand rested gently on the leather pouch at his belt, a memorial to fallen comrades, a sacred relic of a history few would ever understand. The general's reverence toward him was mirrored in the silent awe of the entire assembly. Even after the formal address concluded, the lesson lingered. It was not authority or brute force that commanded respect. It was honor, sacrifice, and a lifetime of silent courage. Stanley Burns had reminded everyone that heroes do not always appear as they seem, and that the heart behind the uniform defines true valor. After the revelation at the gate, a heavy silence lingered. Miller and Davies, once brimming with arrogance, now stood shamed under Stanley Burns' calm gaze. Every heartbeat seemed amplified, the hum of the bass around them fading into insignificance. Stanley's eyes, pale and sharp despite age, swept over them, not with rage, but with measured purpose. "Son," he began, his voice low but resonant, "you've worn your uniform like armor to feel strong. But strength does not come from fabric or insignia. It comes from the choices you make and the respect you show." He gestured toward the base, where soldiers and civilians alike still watched, smartphones poised. Fear of doing the wrong thing is a better compass than pride. Miller's head hung low. The weight of Stanley's words pressed on him more effectively than any reprimand from a superior. Private Davies sobbed quietly, ashamed, yet listening intently. Stanley continued, "You must learn to follow the right leaders and understand whose shoulders you stand upon. That knowledge will guide your actions far better than blind confidence ever could." Meanwhile, General Thompson, still standing respectfully beside Stanley, observed quietly. The depth of Stanley Burns' wisdom was evident in the calm authority he exuded. Thompson's mind processed not just Stanley's words, but the story behind every wrinkle, every scar, every artifact on his person. This was a man who had carried the weight of history quietly for decades, a living testament to courage and discretion. The next day, a new initiative was born. Miller and Davies were reassigned, not punished through court-martial, but through education. For 6 months, they would escort elderly veterans, listen to their stories, assist them, and learn firsthand the meaning of respect, humility, and valor. The Burns Protocol, a training module emphasizing de-escalation, observation, and dignity, was officially implemented across all base security personnel. Stanley Burns, meanwhile, returned to his quiet routines. Yet the lessons he imparted resonated far beyond the gates of Fort Hamilton. He had transformed humiliation into enlightenment, teaching the next generation that heroism was often uncelebrated, quiet, and deeply human. Weeks had passed since the incident at the Fort Hamilton gate. The echoes of Stanley Burns' words had not faded. They lingered like a gentle yet persistent wind, shaping the hearts of those who had witnessed the encounter. Corporal Miller and Private Davies now approached their duties with a cautious humility, their eyes scanning not for mistakes to punish, but for stories to honor. Miller, once brash and impulsive, had begun to understand the weight of history carried by every veteran who entered the base. Each handshake, each nod of acknowledgement, reminded him that valor often went unseen. His nights were restless, filled with recollections of the day he had underestimated an old man's presence. The tremor of fear in his chest whenever he remembered the immediate arrival of General Thompson's escort, Private Davies, still young but infinitely wiser, had grown quiet and observant. She listened to tales of courage from veterans of distant wars, noting not only the events but the lessons etched in the lines of their faces. She had learned to measure her own pride against the dignity of those who had served. Stanley Burns, in his off-base life, returned to a simple diner booth he'd frequented for decades. There, the aroma of coffee and worn vinyl seats offered a comforting rhythm to his days. He reflected on the past, the friendships forged in conflict, the sacrifices that could never be fully acknowledged. Though the gates of Fort Hamilton no longer challenged him, the lesson he had imparted continued to ripple outward, influencing the lives of soldiers who had once dismissed him. Miller eventually approached the diner, nervously adjusting his civilian attire. His steps slowed as he entered, the weight of humility pressing down on his shoulders. Stanley looked up, eyes meeting his with calm acknowledgement. "Sit down, Corporal," he invited, voice gruff but kind. Miller obeyed, settling into the booth opposite the veteran. Words came haltingly, apologies sincere, devoid of the theatrics that had marked the earlier confrontation. "This time I understand," Miller admitted, voice low, eyes fixed on his hands. "I've listened. I've seen. I had no idea." His sentence trailed off, a mixture of shame and newfound respect. Stanley sipped his coffee, the movement deliberate, a small genuine smile touching his lips. "Now you do," he said simply, allowing the lesson to settle. Silence, warm and profound, filled the space between them, a bridge forged through understanding, respect and human connection. Outside, the world continued its rhythm, but within that quiet booth, history, humility, and heroism converged. Miller left the diner that day changed, carrying the weight and wisdom of Stanley Burns' life story forward into every encounter he would have thereafter. The early morning sun cast long shadows across Fort Hamilton, bathing the sprawling base in a golden haze. Corporal Miller and Private Davies had begun their reassignment under the Burns Protocol, a task that demanded patience, humility, and attentiveness. Their new role was simple in description, but profound in execution: personally welcome and escort elderly veterans, listening to their stories, acknowledging their sacrifices, and ensuring their dignity was preserved. On his first day, Miller escorted a small group of veterans into the base museum. Each man and woman carried the weight of decades, visible in their slow steps, weathered hands, and quiet gazes. Miller's heart tightened as he observed their cautious anticipation. He understood that many had been overlooked, dismissed, or underestimated throughout their lives. Now it was his responsibility to honor them. Private Davies followed closely behind, carrying a set of documents and historical artifacts. She had developed a sensitivity to the veterans' emotions, learning to anticipate the moments when silence was needed and when gentle conversation could coax stories into the open. Each anecdote of courage, from the Normandy beaches to Fallujah's deserts, was absorbed. Each act of heroism a lesson in humility for the young soldiers, the veterans. Stories were not just tales of battlefield exploits. They were chronicles of endurance, moral choice, and camaraderie. Miller found himself marveling at the resilience in the lines of their faces, the way they spoke of fallen comrades without bitterness, and the pride that shone through the memories of missions accomplished under impossible odds. Each interaction became a mirror reflecting his own shortcomings and the potential for growth. By midday, the duo had guided a wheelchair-bound veteran through the museum halls, gently lifting bags and guiding steps, attending to needs with newfound attentiveness. The museum, filled with sunlight filtering through tall windows, became a stage where respect and learning played out. Miller and Davies realized that their prior arrogance had been a barrier, not only to understanding the veterans' stories, but to understanding themselves. In the quiet moments between tours, Stanley Burns' presence lingered like a guiding shadow. His words about pride, fear, and the heart of a soldier echoed in their minds. The lessons were no longer abstract. They were living, tangible, shaping every interaction, every expression, every gesture. The young soldiers had begun to internalize what true service, honor, and dignity meant. As the day ended, Miller paused outside the museum, looking at the setting sun casting a warm glow over the base. He felt an unfamiliar sense of peace, born from a connection to history, humanity, and the wisdom of those who had walked before him. Davies stood beside him, equally reflective. Understanding that the Burns Protocol was more than a corrective assignment, it was a transformation, one that would ripple through their careers and lives forever. The base auditorium was filled with a quiet anticipation that seemed almost tangible. Today marked the culmination of the Burns Protocol initiative, a formal ceremony recognizing the invaluable contributions of veterans who had been escorted and honored over the past months. Flags draped the walls, sunlight streaming through tall windows. Casting a reverent glow on the polished wooden floor, Corporal Miller and Private Davies, now dressed in clean uniforms with their newly earned poise, stood near the front. Each had internalized lessons of humility and respect, evident in their steady posture and attentive expressions. Veterans, some frail, others robust despite their age, filled the seats. Their medals, ribbons, and worn insignias told silent stories of courage, endurance, and sacrifice. As Stanley Burns entered, the room seemed to shift. Even among a crowd of distinguished veterans, his presence commanded subtle reverence. The echoes of his past missions, unknown to most in attendance, seemed to ripple through the hall. He moved slowly, a figure of quiet authority, the leather pouch at his belt visible as a symbol of his unbroken commitment to the fallen. The ceremony began with speeches that highlighted service, courage, and the importance of remembering those who served. Each veteran introduced, escorted by Miller and Davies, was greeted with personalized attention. The young soldiers assisted them to the stage, handed microphones, and provided gentle guidance. Their faces, once filled with arrogance and impatience, now radiated respect, attentiveness, and a growing pride in their role as custodians of history. Miller listened as a decorated veteran recounted a harrowing mission during the Cold War, detailing acts of bravery and moments of fear. Every word reinforced the lessons Stanley Burns had imparted, that honor was more than recognition, it was understanding, listening, and remembering. Private Davies, beside him, held back tears, silently acknowledging the weight of the stories and the transformative power of empathy and humility. By the time the ceremony concluded, the auditorium resonated with applause, laughter, and heartfelt exchanges. Veterans shook hands with Miller and Davies, sharing personal words of encouragement and gratitude. Stanley Burns offered a nod of approval to the young soldiers, a subtle yet powerful acknowledgement of their growth. The event became not only a celebration of past deeds, but a living testament to the enduring importance of dignity, respect, and remembrance. A month later, Stanley Burns sat quietly in his usual booth at the local diner off post, a familiar hum of chatter and clinking cups around him. The cracked vinyl seats, the aroma of fresh coffee, and the morning sunlight streaming through the windows offered a comforting normalcy. Today, however, he was not alone in his solitude. Corporal Miller, dressed in civilian clothes, entered hesitantly. The swagger and arrogance that once defined him had evaporated, replaced by a tentative humility. His eyes locked on Stanley, a mixture of apprehension and newfound respect evident in his posture. Stanley gestured toward the empty seat across from him. "Sit down, Corporal," he said, his gravelly voice calm yet commanding. Miller sat, hands resting on the tabletop, staring silently at his palms. The words he had rehearsed felt insufficient compared to the weight of the moment. "Sir," he finally began, voice low and sincere, "I wanted to apologize for real this time, not because a general told me to." His eyes brimmed with genuine remorse. Reflecting a soldier transformed by understanding, Stanley nodded slowly, taking a deliberate sip of coffee. "Now you do," he said, a small, genuine smile touching his lips for the first time in months. The silence that followed was comfortable, shared between an old hero and a young soldier who had finally grasped the meaning of true respect. The lesson Stanley had imparted extended far beyond the boundaries of Fort Hamilton. Stories of the Burns Protocol and the Dignity Initiative had spread across the base, transforming the way veterans were received, honored, and listened to. Corporal Miller and Private Davies continued their roles, ensuring that every elderly veteran felt seen, respected, and valued. As Stanley watched the young soldier, he reflected on the enduring power of legacy. True heroism did not reside in medals or accolades alone, but in the quiet guidance, the respect for others, and the preservation of history. Miller had learned, the veterans had been honored, and the memory of fallen comrades carried forward. The world, small and large, had shifted subtly that day. The unassuming heroism of Stanley Burns remained, a testament to courage, dignity, and the enduring strength of the human spirit.